Hello, public opinion aficionados, and welcome to Rasmussen Reports, where we like to shine a light on issues affecting national elections, things like failing national party leadership. And that's a pretty important topic if you want to be accurate. You can't just go out into the field anymore and ask people what they think and think you're going to be able to predict elections. Now you have to get into things like voter enthusiasm, advertising spend, voter registration, and increasingly the asymmetry of capabilities between leaders of both national parties. And let me tell you, after the 2022 election, reviews of the Republican National Committee are not good. Let's start with Ron McDaniel's favorability rating. 9% of voters have a very favorable opinion of her, 23% is somewhat favorable, for a combined favorability rating of 32%. That's pretty low. It's below Biden and Trump for sure by quite a bit, but also almost every major recent presidential candidate. Her unfavorable rating is 42%, but 24% of people have a very unfavorable rating. Now, if you're doing the math, what you're missing is 26% of people who just aren't sure. But here are the party numbers. As you'd expect, Democrats don't have a very high opinion of her. She has a 25% favorable rating among them, but that is somewhat higher than Republicans view most Democrat leaders. But look at her unfavorable rating among Democrats. It's 52%, but only 32% have a very unfavorable opinion, and that's kind of lower than you'd expect. But look at Republicans. She's their party, and she's not viewed favorable. Only 10% of Republicans view Ronna McDaniel very favorably. 33% say somewhat, for a combined total of 43%, and that's really low. But what's really stunning is what percentage of Republicans aren't sure, 22%. And that's kind of high considering the power she has and how long she's been in office. Now, if you want to compare those, her numbers are low, but nowhere near as low as Mitch McConnell, who basically polls like a Democrat among Republicans, or her uncle, Mitt Romney, who set Republican unfavorable records after he voted to impeach Donald Trump. But just as a benchmark, the most recent time we tested Trump favorability, Trump got an 81% overall favorable rating among Republicans and a 56% very favorable rating. His unfavorability was only 19 points, 8% of those very. And even Kevin McCarthy from the same month, January 2023, as these Ronna McDaniel numbers, did way better. He got a 24% very favorable among Republicans and a 31% somewhat favorable, for a combined total of 55%. Again, what's that? 12 points higher than Ronna McDaniel. And that was the month he got ousted. And Republicans kind of wanted to see Ronna McDaniel get ousted for a long time now. Asked also in January, attorney Harmeet Dillon and businessman Mike Lindell are challenging Ronna McDaniel to become the chair of the RNC. 20% of Republicans said Harmeet Dillon, 30% said Mike Lindell, and only 15% said Ronna McDaniel. And again, that's a position she's been in for a very long time. By a 2-to-1 margin, voters in the Republican Party wanted Mike Lindell, who really doesn't have any political experience. And even Harmeet Dillon, who, quite frankly, to most voters is somewhat of an unknown, edged her out by 5 points. But of course, as usual, Republican voters didn't get what Republican voters want. And that brings us to the next question. In terms of helping elect candidates for their party, which has been more effective in recent years, the Democrat National Committee or the Republican National Committee? Amongst all likely voters, again, back in January 2023, 40% said the Democrats and only 20% said the Republicans. For a pretty divided nation, that's a really strong signal that people think the Democrats are more effective than the Republicans by a 2-to-1 margin, and only 1 out of 5 voters on the street would tell you that the Republicans are more effective at getting their candidates elected. 27% of voters say both parties are about equally effective, and 13% say not sure. If you correct for those numbers, then it's 67% DNC to only 33% RNC. Again, pretty horrifying. But here are the party numbers. And amongst Republicans, only 43% of Republicans think their party is effective at getting their candidates elected. But 26% of Republicans say the DNC. That's kind of slim, and it's not very symbolic of a lot of confidence. But look at Democrats. They're far and away much more confident in their own party and its ability to get its people elected. 59% to 8% Democrats say the DNC is more effective than the RNC. Only 8% of Democrats think that their political opponents are effective. Now, independents ostensibly don't have a dog in this hunt. Most of them don't like both major political parties, and that's why over the past 5 or 10 years, the number of independents in the electorate has been steadily increasing. But by almost a 3-to-1 margin, they also say that Democrats are much more effective than Republicans at getting candidates elected. But to me, the headline here has to be that 43%. Only 43% of Republicans are confident that their party is best at getting candidates elected. And you have to understand that this is just mere months after Republicans won the national popular vote in the congressional race, and they picked up a number of seats in Congress in the teens. Now, clearly there was a lot of things the Republicans could have done better in that cycle, considering our early polling gave Republicans the biggest lead they'd ever had in the congressional ballot. But that lead steadily disappeared over the next year and a half. And that's the thing. You can't just have a platform. You also have to have a machine. But what may be good news or bad news for Republicans is that there's a new sheriff in town, or sheriffs, plural. Donald Trump's daughter-in-law, Lara Trump, and Michael Whatley, the head of the Republican Party in North Carolina, have recently just been appointed to lead the Republican National Committee, ousting Ronna McDaniel. Early reporting is that it's been a bloodbath, and lots of staff has been let go after being asked purity test questions. Undoubtedly, many Republican voters are paying very close attention. But what do they think about it? Are early impressions good or bad? Since Donald Trump has clinched the Republican presidential nomination, he's replaced much of the staff of the Republican National Committee. And voters overwhelmingly approve. 40% of them strongly approve, and another 20% somewhat, for a combined total of 60%. And that 60% number is really meaningful because with today's weighting, if every single Republican approved, it would still only be 33%. 27% somewhat disapprove, and only 13% strongly disapprove. And that's a combined total of 40% who disapprove. And Republicans are happy as a clam. That's an overwhelming approve number. 51% strongly approve, and another 25% somewhat approve, for a combined total of 76% at least somewhat approving. And if you were paying attention, those numbers are pretty similar to Donald Trump's favorability among Republican voters as well. Only 13% of Republican voters disapprove, and only 8% strongly disapprove, which is, again, pretty meaningful because the never Trumper wing of the Republican Party is only about 15 to 20 points, depending on the poll we take. But look at independents. Again, ostensibly, they do not have a dog in this fight, and 28% of independents strongly approve, and another 26% at least somewhat approve, for a combined total of 44%, or a plurality of independents approving. But Democrats, that is a disapprove signal. 40% strongly disapprove, and another 15% somewhat, for a combined total of 55%. There's probably a lot of conflicting things going on here. Maybe some Democrat voters think that this will make the Republicans more incompetent, maybe some less, and maybe some are just happy to see DC party muckety-mucks have their heads roll. But what's interesting to me is that the biggest signal for this question in the crosstabs was among Biden approval. How people view Joe Biden's job performance had the biggest impact on whether they approved or disapproved of the Republican National Committee leadership change. And I think what you're seeing here is a signal about establishment leadership and a desire to overthrow it. Only 15% of Joe Biden strong approvers strongly approved of the decision to replace all the staff at the RNC, and only 21% at least somewhat approved. But 59% strongly disapproved, and another 11% somewhat disapproved, for a combined total of 70%. That's the highest of any demographic. But look at Joe Biden strong disapprovers. 55% of them strongly approved of the changes, which is higher than Republicans, and another 23% somewhat approved, for a combined total of 78%. But let's check in again on the effectiveness of the national parties. Which party is more effective at winning elections? Democrats or Republicans? 41% of voters now, and these numbers are, from last week, 41% say Democrats, and 17%, only 17% say Republicans. If you remember, the last time we asked just a year ago, it was 40% to 20%. So that 20-point margin is now a 24-point margin, and that's a pretty big move in only a year. So voters' opinions of the Republicans have not been going in the right direction. But again, to the party numbers, and Republicans are losing even more faith in their national leaders. Now, only 34% of Republicans, down from 43% a year ago, say that Republicans are better at winning elections. And 28% of Republicans say that Democrats are. And Democrats are just as confident, these numbers really haven't moved much, just as confident in their own party at getting candidates elected. But look again at independents, and those numbers are now 4-1 instead of the 3-1 that they were a year ago. But I threw this slide up just to make a quick point. If you look at the strongly disapprove row, those are people who strongly disapprove of Joe Biden's job performance. Way more conservative than Republicans or even people who call themselves conservative. And by a majority, 33% to 22%, they say that Democrats are better at winning elections than Republicans are. That's a pretty defeatist view. And again, what I think you're seeing is a very strong anti-establishment signal. But we have one more topic to get into. Recently, one of the new RNC co-chairs, Michael Whatley, said you've got to have observers and attorneys in the room when the votes are being cast and when the votes are being counted. Now, people who follow Rasmussen reports know that we really care a lot about election integrity. How can you predict election outcomes if they're stolen and don't reflect the will of the people? So we asked about it. How important is it for parties to have observers in polling places to make sure election results are fair and accurate? And 55% of voters, a pretty big number, and another 20% say somewhat important for a combined total of 75%. Well, that's a pretty big number, but actually it's kind of nowhere near the number of people who say things like inflation is going to be important in the next election, or it's important to stop violent crime. And here are the party numbers, and Republicans are much more likely than anyone else to think it's very important, 71% to 40% for just Democrats, to have people in the room when elections are decided. Another 14% of Republicans say somewhat important for a combined total of 85%. That's a really big number. Among Democrats, the combined number is 67%, so 2/3. But only 40% of Democrat voters think that it's important for parties to have observers in polling places to make sure election results are fair and accurate. That's kind of low. Independents are polling in between Republicans and Democrats on this. But now I'm going to show you some very stunning numbers. And when you see them, if you agree, please like the video and subscribe on YouTube or Rumble. It helps get this information out to more people. And here it is. This is the same question about party election observers, displayed by how people view Joe Biden's job performance. Let me tell you what, people who hate Joe Biden, strongly disapprove, overwhelmingly think it's very important to have someone in the room. 80% of them say very important. Another 10% say somewhat important, for a combined total of 90% who think it's important. But the story here is what everyone else thinks. People who strongly approve of Biden, somewhat approve, even somewhat disapprove. Those people don't think it's very important. It's only about 1/3 of them, 33%, compared to 80%. And amongst Joe Biden strong approvers, it barely gets to a majority thinking it's important overall. What about you? Do you think it's important for parties to have observers in polling places? Post your thoughts in the YouTube or Rumble comments. What is it about Joe Biden and his presidency that causes this much of a mental disconnect between people? I'll tell you, this administration has been a very interesting experiment in public opinion. We're learning all new things, terms like mass formation. Don't forget to check out our COVID polling, by the way. And this is just an incredible response. As a good pollster, what we're looking for is a signal. What I'd love to see is a question that perfectly separates people into one group or another. Increasingly, it's not race, it's not party, it's not even how people view their own political ideology. If you tell me what you think about Joe Biden, I can pretty accurately predict your view on topics like whether it's important to have oversight of elections. Now, there's just something about this presidency that brought out a lot of division in this country, and it's pretty interesting since he ran on uniting the country. If you haven't seen it yet, we did a whole video on that topic, which I'll put at the end of the video on YouTube. So follow the link. Again, like the video, subscribe on YouTube or Rumble. Follow us on Twitter at Rasmussen_poll, where we go into topics like election integrity. And thanks for watching.